Tonight's talk is titled Hearts and Minds, the book launched the U.S. Empire's cultural industry. Tanner teaches at UOIT and is also, besides Hearts and Mind, has also published recently Global Entertainment Media. He will be hosted, chaired, discussed, interrogated by Scott Forsyth. Scott is one of my colleagues and comrades from the York University, one of the great commentators on the Hollywood film industry as well, and militarism in cinema. And he's published widely in Cine Action, the Socialist Register, the Canadian Journal for Film Studies, and so on and so forth. I turn it over to the two of them. Here you go.
Thanks so much, Scott. And thanks so much, Greg. And thanks so much for Bea Tatuan. And thanks so much to everyone in the room tonight who have been great mentors, friends, colleagues, peers, comrades, activists, and confidants. There's so many people in the room tonight that have meant a lot to me over the years as students, as teachers, as friends, and family as well. So thanks so much for being here. I think I'll start with a quote by Herbert I. Schiller, who in 1969 published Mass Communications and American Empire. United States power, expressed industrially, militarily, culturally, has become the most potent force on earth, and communications have become a decisive element in the extension of the United States world power. So said the late Herbert Schiller in the path-breaking 1969 publication, Mass Communications and American Empire. Schiller, a democratic socialist and founding figure in the political economy of communications tradition, was the first US scholar to conceptualize the United States as a unique post-colonial empire. Schiller focused on how since 1945 the US was relied upon a mix of diplomacy and brute military force to make the world safe for American and then transnational capitalism. Unlike bygone colonial empires, the US post-45 did not directly dominate territories, take colonies and such, but instead strove to build and integrate and police a world system of allied states that shared its model. Capitalism, the liberal state form, of course contradicting that regularly in practice, and of course the consumerist way of life that was sold or branded as Americanism throughout the Cold War period. Schiller focused on how the cultural industry supported and promoted the US empire's expansion. And that was the distinctive contribution made by Schiller. There are many rich theories of imperialism, of neocolonialism coming out in this moment, but Schiller was the first to concentrate on the important communicational role that these industries were playing in selling the US way of life around the world, but also in opening up markets for other sectors of US capitalism. The immense economic and military power of the US is complemented by concentrations of communications and media power. Indeed, the US continues to be home to the world's global media giants. Large, profitable, and globalizing media companies certainly exist in other countries, and Schiller accounted for this in the 70s. And these companies often have ties to their host states, states that are facilitating, legitimizing the internationalization of their operations, just as the United States does. Yet the Forbes Global 2000 list shows 9 of the top 10 media companies to be based in the United States. Comcast, Walt Disney, 21st Century Fox, Time Warner Cable, DirecTV, CBS, Viacom, and B-Sky Broadcasting. 8 of the top most visited websites, the titans of digital capitalism that of course are giant vacuums for your personal data, which trade and sort of the commodification of your data. These are the new media empires. Are of course owned by US-based giants. Google.com, YouTube.com, Facebook.com, Yahoo.com, Wikipedia.org, and Amazon.com, Google.co India, Twitter.com. These US digital giants are not the only players, of course, in the interweb. Note the position of Chinese websites like Baidu.com and QQ.com. These are big Chinese digital media companies. But the US are still by far the most significant and the most profitable. In fact, according to this list, I sort of studied all of the different sectors related to the information age, digital capitalism, media and communications, every single sector related to the production, distribution, exhibition of informational or media content. And the US houses 92 of the global giants. The BRICS have 25 in total and don't come close to a rivalry with the US just yet. So with regard to its combined capitalist, military, and communications power and reach, the US is still very much an empire. That said, the quantifiable reality of the US empire's combined power is an important counterpoint to hard and fast declinism. But the reified image of power it conveys masks the social power relations, the class relations that it perpetuates. So much of the US empire's power is rationalized as necessary to securing America from real and imagined threats to it. But though national security foregrounds the well-being of a collective, a nation, and us as opposed to a them, this interest does not substantively serve the interests of everyone. The US empire is one in which the corporate rich and powerful preside over the state, and the many are compelled to sell their labor in exchange for the wage they need to live. An empire in which the security planning structure is hierarchical, centralized, exclusionary, and elitist. We can go back and read Lippmann and read Bernays and read others that basically say the public should not play a role in foreign policy decision making. We need to manage the opinion as opposed to use that opinion as an input to democratic decision making. And this has been the case since World War I at the earliest. The national security interest largely serves transnational corporate interests, while masking this fact by depicting what's good for global companies is good for America and vice versa. As the US empire grows, so does inequality. The US is home to the most concentrated private wealth on the planet, 63.5 trillion in total. But it is also the country which has the largest wealth inequality gap between the rich and the poor. The 0.1% of America's super rich takes in upwards of 25 million a year, while more than half of Americans scrape by on under 30,000. As the US share of world GDP has gone down, the compensation for American CEOs has gone up. America's top CEOs now make an average of more than 300 times the typical waged worker. In 2014, the CEOs of the US's biggest global media companies, Comcast, Walt Disney, News Corp, Time Warner, CBS, and Viacom, each pocketed a median compensation of $32.9 million. Donald Thompson, CEO of McDonald's, gets paid 644 times more than the average McDonald's worker whose fight for 15 continues to be thwarted, as if some poor billionaire would suffer if $15 minimum wage is in place. Well, the US empire cannot do without guns. The US state's low taxes on the rich and squeezing of the working class, plus austerity measures, has made the provisioning of public goods less a priority. The state spent 3 to 7 trillion on the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, killing an estimated 1.3 million civilians in the process, and stoking global anti-American blowback. Yet it doesn't have the resources or mechanisms in place to feed the 15.3 million children under the age of 18 currently living in hunger and abject poverty. It allocates hundreds of billions of dollars to R&D of technologies of death by the likes of Lockheed Martin, take the F-15 for example, while its own infrastructure crumbles and public schools and peaceful routes to a good life get defunded. The public education system teachers add more value to society than defense contractors do, yet they have joined their students as the precarious poor as well. Push to see college, not class struggle, as the path out of poverty. The working poor signs up to be sent off to war in exchange for tuition, but many return home with PTSD and are unable to live, let alone go back to school. In 2014, approximately 22 Afghanistan and Iraq war veterans killed themselves each day. Since 1962, the US state has funneled more than $100 billion in aid to Israel, $38 billion over the next 10 years, as per the latest agreement. Yet it still can't find the cash to build proper public housing capable of caring for America's poorest. It bailed out Wall Street with $16.8 trillion, yet can barely fathom a living wage to lessen the immiseration of American workers, again without neoliberal think tanks blasting that some poor billionaires will suffer. And this is, of course, a funny line by Thomas Frank. The US empire expands, and with it, class inequality between the property few who benefit from ongoing wars for the security of transnational capital and the millions of workers made insecure by its costs. That said, the US empire is not spontaneously liked or always already approved of by Americans or by the world. From its earliest days, the US empire has been contested by a very rich tradition of American anti-imperialists and by anti-imperialists all over the world. Since 9/11, many have done the Republic a service by calling for the US empire to be dismantled. And despite the US empire's many perils and sorrows, a large number of Americans still believe they live in the world's best country. And the millions who don't want to and are being seduced by Trump to make America great again, which of course would only make it far more worse. Around the world, however, Pew, the global sort of public opinion poll, notes that global opinion about the United States is mostly positive. Remarkable, given what I just communicated. So the American dream might be alive and well, despite its objective destruction. Given these contradictions, what might compel so many people to accept this empire as a way of life? Why might people look so favorably upon the US empire, no matter how controversial its actions are? What means do the US empire's planners rely upon to make the class interest in neoliberalism and capitalism and war appear to be the collective, the national, the security interest of all? The US state has long relied upon the cultural industry's creative labor power. There's a wonderful tradition now in the political economy of communication, spearheaded by Nicole Cohen and Greg Japuter and others, that focus on work and labor in the cultural industries. And what I've sort of looked at going back to World War I is how many of these cultural industry workers were essentially assigned to become propagandists for the United States during its times of war as well. So it's interesting to see how cultural and creative labor power can get aligned with creating essentially imperial media commodities and propaganda. So going back to World War I, the US state and the cultural industry forged a cozy relationship via the Committee on Public Information. In How We Advertised America, CPI head George Creel famously declared that the CPI was, quote, a plain publicity proposition, a vast enterprise in salesmanship, and the world's greatest adventure in advertising. From the CPI in World War I to the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs in the interwar period, which hired Walt Disney Company to make a lot of happy films for the Good Neighbor policy in Latin America, to the Office of War Information in World War II, to the United States Information Agency throughout the Cold War, and the Office of Public Diplomacy in the US War on Terror, which hired Charlotte Beers, Queen of Madison Avenue, to rebrand America and sell it to the so-called Muslim world. Of course, there is no Muslim world. There is one world, and there are Muslim peoples, and there are other peoples, but there is this worlding going on in the post-9/11 context. The Muslims became a world in and of itself that the US needed to change to make over in its image. The US state has consistently established through all of these periods of national security crisis and war without end links with the cultural industries to promote US empire to the world. Well, that brings me to my book, the Hearts and Minds, the US Empire's Cultural Industry. It theorizes and historicizes this contradictory convergence of the interests of the US state and the interest of those of US-based globalizing cultural industry companies. The concept of the US empire's culture industry flags a nexus of the state, striving to promote itself and engineer public consent to dominant ideas about America and US foreign policy at home and all over the world, and US-based globalizing media companies seeking to make money by producing and selling cultural commodities to consumers in world markets. Although the state and the capital are relatively autonomous, these organizations pursue distinct interests, the state pursuing national security and capital profit maximization. I show how these two spheres, the economic and the political, work together to manufacture and sell cultural products that sell empire as a way of life. The US state and media companies don't always march in lockstep. Of course, there are many liberals in Hollywood, and that just isn't a conservative Andrew Breitbart sort of talking point. There are many liberals that make many liberal films. But when it comes to national security and war, we often see a more collusive relationship between cultural industry producers and the state than is often recognized, theorized, and critiqued. Faced with anger at home and blowback abroad, the US empire's culture industry is now deploying an even larger army of commodities that strive to get a grip on the hearts and minds of American and transnational publics, so that the empire will continue to be admired or at least tolerated. This might give us some clue, again, as to why the Pew polls keep coming back with favorable opinions to the United States. If indeed we're to trust Pew, maybe we shouldn't. But here are a few examples of these imperial commodities, and there are hundreds that we could discuss, and not hundreds in my book, but a few. In 2012, US-based Capitol Records teen idol Katy Perry hooked up with the US Marines to make the MTV-ready music video for her hit song, Part of Me. In this video, Perry catches a cheating boyfriend, and it's really sad, and she starts to almost cry. But instead of getting sort of sad, she gets angry, and she gets taken by a military recruitment ad that tells her, quote, all women are created equal, then some become Marines. An interesting sort of militarized feminist sort of address here. Despite her boyfriend and cope with heartbreak, Perry indeed joins the Marines, cuts her hair, camel paints her face, and endures basic training at the Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, alongside actual US Marines who dance, sing, and fight along to her song. So Perry's singing, Marines are shooting, they are dancing together, they are laughing, they're crying, they're sort of now this interesting fighting force. Following part of me, Perry said, shooting the video along turned her into a wannabe Marine and made her, quote, so educated on the people in the service who she has always respected as the true heart of America. In the same year that the US Marines enlisted Perry's pop image to portray military service as a righteous path to women's liberation, Warner Bros. Pictures, a giant Hollywood studio, prepared to release The Man of Steel. This blockbuster film cast the classic DC Comics character Superman alongside the men and women of Team Edwards Air Force Base and their Air Force's multi-million-dollar stealth jet, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. Superman and the F-35 fly over Smallville together at the speed of light, securing it from alien evil. Quote, it was a great choice, says Mark Schoon, an executive at Warner Bros. Our experience at the Edwards has been beyond phenomenal. No matter how you look at it, from the bottom up or top down, there's been an extraordinary cooperation across the board between Hollywood and the DoD. And the DoD has a gigantic entertainment liaison office that services every single branch of the DoD, and every one of those offices has 20 to 30 public affairs officers that liaison with Hollywood studios, and they very much co-produce imperial commodities, directly sort of shaping, contractually shaping. Actually, there is a network of cultural intermediaries that service Hollywood studios that want to work with the DoD. So before even going to Phil Strub of the Department of Defense Entertainment Liaison Office, they have to pitch a script, and it's subject to reviews. But before even pitching a script or getting it reviewed, they hire a number of military advisors that have hitherto worked with the DoD's Public Affairs Office just to make sure that the DoD wouldn't like, would like or wouldn't like what's being said. So for example, the entire Transformers trilogy, it's a big blockbuster film that is basically a propaganda piece for General Motors and the DoD, was made through this sort of DoD-Hollywood co-production relationship as well. So while Man of Steel traveled the globe, taking in $25.8 million from China's box office in one weekend alone, and that's another point to make when you're thinking about the dynamics of media imperialism, asymmetrical relations when it comes to media and communications ownership, one-way or asymmetrical flows of informational content between the US and the other countries. The US exports a lot of entertainment and a lot of media, and it imports far less from other countries. And so even in 2012, US blockbusters topped the Chinese box office, and they're now entering into sort of joint ventures and equity alliances. But this is the US's attempt to integrate China's film studio system into its orbit. Superman and the F-35, I already said that, from China. So NBC was broadcasting a reality TV show in the same year called Stars Earn Stripes. Produced by reality TV mogul Mark Burnett and hosted by a retired military general Wesley Clark, the show pairs B-list actors like Dean Cain, who plays Superman in Lewis and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, Eve Torres, a WWE Divas champion, and Todd Palin, yes, husband of Sarah Palin and snowmobile race champ. Pair these B-list actors with real Navy SEALs, Marines, and Green Berets to complete military training challenges and competitions to win money for various charities. NBC's website described the show as, quote, an action-packed competition show that pays homage to the men and women who serve in the U.S. Armed Forces and our first responder services. In response to criticisms that it cheapened war, U.S. Navy Corpsman Talon Smith candidly clipped, quote, entertainment is how America will receive information. Like just think about the sort of low assessment, right, of the sort of possibility for citizens to participate in their own democracy. Americans will receive information through entertainment, so let's actually manipulate that entertainment to further dupe them, is essentially the message being conveyed. Yet in 2012, many Americans were not passively receiving information about the DoD from TV. Instead, it came from the interactive entertainment market, wherein console wars between companies like Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo raged, and millions of people paid for digital software to virtually play kill as soldiers in virtual and hyperreal wars. The online game Kuma War let people worldwide play and replay simulated versions of US military events, from killing Osama bin Laden to helping Libyan rebels kill Gaddafi. Soon after, the real news, or the corporate news at least, packaged them as having happened. Battlefield 4, meanwhile, recruited players into a virtual war against China. So we see the speculation of future conflict, right? We're simulating it in anticipation of it happening through video games. Well, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 simulated a third world war between the US and Russia. The above are but a few of the hundreds of imperial commodities packaged and sold by the US empire's cultural industry, commodities that are designed to teach people to identify with empire. So the US is an empire, and the pillars of its structural power, economic, military, and communications, remain entrenched around the globe. To promote, glorify, and sell the US empire as a way of life, the cultural industries are vital, and its products tell Americans they must continue waging war over there so that they do not have to fight perhaps a class war over here or over there. An internationalist strategy advises Americans to peacefully struggle against transnational capital over here in solidarity with democratically minded socialists and anti-imperialists everywhere. Instead of focusing on trying to transform other societies, maybe US citizens should focus on changing themselves. A deeply democratic and socially just republic at home cannot exist alongside an empire abroad. Democratic socialists thus face the challenge of dismantling the empire from within, and they can do so united with fellow progressives in the United States and around the world. As McChesney puts it, quote, "If a viable pro-democracy, anti-imperialist movement can emerge in the US, it will improve the possibilities dramatically for socialists and progressives worldwide." Thank you.
Thanks, Tanner. That was a really rich and exciting talk and a real introduction to your book. And the book is, of course, much more detailed and includes many more examples. I want to begin the Q&A just with a couple of questions for Tanner, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. The first is Marxists and socialists have a rich tradition of criticizing and trying to understand popular culture and the cultural industries all through the 20th century and still. And I wondered if you could place yourself in that tradition, which is, of course, very filled with debate and difference, and where do you place yourself, and what has that theoretical background brought to your studies?
Thanks very much, Scott. I don't place myself in one place in the very rich and heterogeneous tradition of Marxist cultural criticism. I've moved between many different positions, I think, in that tradition. And I started as someone who was most interested in literature and the Marxist study of books. Text is really what sort of I went to work on with these Marxist theories, which were incredibly useful. I still think that Jameson's work on the political unconscious and then his later work and still stand out and offer useful models for analyzing texts. I'd sort of moved then over to the Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies, and I was really taken by sort of Stuart Hall's sort of neo-Gramscian work, Dick Heptich and others as well. I then sort of became interested in the political economy of communication, looking at the Westminster School, Nicholas Garnham, Graham Murdoch, and others. And I slowly moved my way over to sort of Herbert Schiller and reading a bit of Robert McChesney as well. Figures that early in my studies appeared mostly as characters of themselves. There was this sort of sense that political economy is vulgar, political economy is too class-centric, political economy is a sort of reductive base superstructure sort of model. And I kind of believed that, or maybe argued that for a few coffee meets with friends, but then I actually picked up Schiller's books, and I read them all, and it was very different. So I sort of am sort of open and excited about any sort of Marxist sort of contribution to the study of culture, whether those sort of cultural products be texts or video games or films or TV shows or posters or comics or ads. Marxism offers this sort of wonderful sort of a number of great theoretical contributions for doing just that. So right now in this book, I'm doing political economy. I'm doing critical political economy of communication. I'm working with sort of a Schillerian and McChesneyan sort of approach. But that's certainly not what I will limit myself to.
Okay. Thank you. So you know everything?
No.
Okay. One of the striking features of the book is the detailed analysis of the role of the state in helping organize cultural production. And of course, the American media industries have always championed their free enterprise approach to culture and lessened the role of the state and argued even all over the world that state public media needed to be dismantled and sold, and that policy has largely triumphed. So I wonder if you might comment on the role of the state in the United States media industry that claims to be a champion of free enterprise.
Yeah, this is one of the myths that needs to be repeatedly and consistently debunked. This sort of bogus sort of liberal or perhaps even neoliberal idea that the state plays no role whatsoever in facilitating or legitimizing capitalist accumulation in any sector of the economy, in particular the communications and cultural industries. This is something that I had the benefit of learning about when I was a first-year PhD student taking Leo Panich's Globalization of the State course, and then working with other sort of great scholars and mentors like Colin Moores and Alan Woods throughout Comcult as well. So we learned about the relationship of the state to capital, and we developed a more adequate theorization of that relationship than liberal or neoclassical political economy afforded us. When it comes to the United States, since 1945, US foreign policy, the State Department has consistently pushed what's called the free flow of information doctrine around the world. And this is the idea that media companies, primarily those based in the United States, should be able to do business wherever they want with no countervailing state sort of barriers to their operations, that it should be able to export its commodities, its entertainment wherever it likes. And this basically means deregulating, privatizing, liberalizing non-US media or communication markets or industries. So if they're public broadcasters, privatize them. If there are content quotas, get rid of them. If there's subsidies for domestic content producers, get rid of those too. That's the free market, baby, as sort of a lot of the rhetoric would suggest. But in practice, it's an entirely different story. The United States has largely run a cultural ministry by not calling a cultural ministry out of the national security state. So when we look at the role that sort of various US propaganda agencies have played, the links and connections they have to various culture industry firms, the relationships between them, the ways they collaborate and co-produce media content, the role of the State Department in acting as kind of a Trojan horse for US media capital around the world, we see sort of very, very interesting relationships between the state and capital in the sector. Moreover, a recent WikiLeaks tranche just suggested that the US Embassy here in Toronto is quite frustrated with Canadian citizens because we pirate far too many of the American TV shows. And the Motion Picture Association of America is mad at us, so be warned. So theories of the state are crucial to theorizing the power of the cultural industries today. And also, this notion of trade follows the military. Well, audiovisual trade in many of the wars, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, we're following the USIA, we're following various federal level government media and propaganda agencies as well.
Okay, thanks. Maybe a final kind of big question for Tanner that it challenges some of the premises that Marxists bring to popular culture, or criticizes Marxists. For one, underestimating the complexity of art and of popular culture, understanding that popular art and culture are contradictory and have many kinds of meanings, as opposed to that line of argument which ends in a designation of propaganda. And secondly, just to make it even more of a challenge, that Marxists underestimate the pleasure and the artistry of popular culture, and that people bring to all kinds of things, from Transformers to more obviously recognized works of art. So I wonder if you think you fall into these characteristics, or if you think that you've taken account of that in some ways.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the sort of uses and meanings that people make of US militainment, of propaganda, both in the United States and around the world. But in this book, my primary goal is to focus on the organizations that create, that distribute, that exhibit that content, with the goal of changing how people think and behave. I put a little caveat in saying, like, I get that's really important stuff, looking at the sort of reception context, looking at decoding, doing ethnography of the sort of uses and gratifications of entertainment. This is all very important, but I don't do it in this book. But I'm not making any substantive claim about the effect or the impact that these attempts or these efforts have on people. What I'm actually trying to demonstrate is that there are attempts to influence, to persuade, to dissuade, to shape how people think and behave. But in the last instance, we don't know what effect this has. So I'm sort of speculating in that regard. So I'm saying I'm not going to make any definitive claims about the effects of this. But what I could show you is all these attempts by these large organizations to have these effects. Also, I think that the Marxist interpretation of culture, or any kind of critical interpretation of culture, is pedagogically and politically useful. I think the kinds of readings and interpretations that we make of Hollywood blockbusters can align very well with ongoing political struggles against capitalism or neoliberalism or war. So part of the meaning that's made of text isn't sort of inherent to the text itself, but emerges in relationship between the context of reception, the person doing the interpreting, their sort of political and ideological objectives. And so we can sort of take popular culture and make it meaningful and articulating it to struggles of our time. I can think about the role that James Cameron's Avatar played in a lot of struggles around the world as people were taking up that film, particularly in contexts of indigenous struggles against accumulation by dispossession, and saying, what's happening to the fictional Na'vi person in Avatar is what's happening to us. James Cameron's got it right, it's correct. And so essentially activists were using Avatar to make a statement about their own relationship to capitalist dispossession and their fight against it. So I think that's something that activists should always do, is to try to take up these various popular forms and articulate them to the struggles of the day. Because these forms, of course, is how many people come to sort of know themselves in relations to others in the world. They're sites of popularity, they're sites of pleasure, they're sources of cultural power. And so to simply abandon those forms and let Hollywood have all the fun with them would be a disservice to progressive struggles today.
Okay.
Otherwise, thank you.